Yo, hi folks, GG here, continuing our little mini-series, Something to Think About, from Dr. Richard Allen Miller, to me, to you. And we're gonna, so the last part we got off with was system and structure. Now, the next part is called Essence and Phenomenon. Now, this is a pretty long part, so I might break this into two parts. I might cut it halfway through, or I might just take like a little commercial break halfway through and then do the second half. But this part of the chapter is pretty long. Now, for anybody that's not familiar with this mini-series here, and for some reason you're just now listening to part 4 first, what this is so Dr. Richard Allen Miller is a guest on our show from time to time. Shift happens. And, every time I talk to him on the phone, we always end up talking about all kinds of everything and nothing under the sun, about reality and quantum physics and spirituality, you name it. And usually at the end of every phone call, he always has something to share, and he'll email me, some articles or some unpublished work of his, or some old studies of some kind. And a couple of times ago when I was on the phone with him, this was what he sent me. It's now this whole series consists of chapter 2 of a book called Dialectical Materialism by A. Spirkin, Spirkim. And chapter 2 is titled The System of Categories and Philosophical Thought. And let me go back here. So we started off, so part 1 was the first 2 sections of chapter 2, the principle of universal connection and development. And then also in that same first episode, we covered the next segment, which was the principle of casualty. And then in episode number 2, we covered system and structure. Or was that part 3? Which one was it? I think then essence and phenomenon is what we're doing today. And so, let me make sure I got all these. Let's see, let's go back. Previous. Oh, no, that's right. So the first episode was space and time and the principle of universal connection development. The second one was the principle of casualty. The third one was system and structure. And now, for this 4th edition, we're doing the essence and phenomenon. And so, without any further, and this is just, again, for those of you that are just not hearing this, this is just, I'm just reading this segment of a book to you, from Dr. Richard Allen Miller to me, to you. And it's very fascinating stuff, so I figured I'd share it with all of you guys in the form of this mini-series. So definitely go back and start with part 1 if you're just now hearing this one. Otherwise, if you're caught up to par, you've listened to the first 3, then let's go ahead and move right along here. Let me take a sip of coffee here. I should have made more coffee. A little vape action. All right, here we go. So this is, once again, from Dialectical Materialism by A. Spirkin, Chapter 2, The System of Categories and Philosophical Thought, and this is the 5th segment of Chapter 2, called Essence and Phenomenon. The concept of essence and phenomenon. All thinking people want to get at the essence. They seek it like hidden treasure, which lies at the heart of things and controls them. Essence may be considered in global terms as the ultimate foundation of the universe, in terms of various categories, such as the essence of human being, for example, and in the sense of the main thing in an individual object. In the early forms of philosophical thought, essence was that from which everything that existed had originated and that to which it would return. The religious consciousness contrasted the celestial world and the temporal world. God was the essence of the universe. Everything else was his creation. The essence of any specific individual is that which he is by virtue of his nature. It is the essential principle in a person, the core of his ego. One could say that it is the special thing in any given person that he cannot lose without ceasing to be himself. Essence is the organizing principle of connection between the basic elements or aspects of an object. It is a kind of thread upon which everything hangs. Cut it and the whole assembly falls to pieces. Nothing is left but elusive particles, and the general order is destroyed. Hold on, let me resize this so I can read this a little better. Bing, bam, boom. All right, there we go. Oh, and haven't been looking at the chat room either. Okay, so here we go. Essence is closely related to content. In fact, it is content, but not the whole content, only the main basic part of it. Essence is related to all categories, to quality, for example. But quality does not exhaust essence. It expresses only one of its aspects. To reveal essence, one must discover measure and proportion, the unity of quality and quantity. The path to essence lies through the categories of cause and law. Essence is an integral category, which embraces structure, part and whole, individual, particular and general, content and quality, proportion, contradiction, casualty, and law. It may also be regarded as an interweaving of the laws of the existence and functioning of an object. As the fundamental basis of the existence of an object, essence manifests itself fully or partially in the form of mere appearance, as a phenomenon. So, what is a phenomenon? It is a manifestation of essence which possesses true actuality only as a consequence of certain forms of its self-manifestation. Just as leaves, flowers, branches, and fruit express in an external form the essence of a plant, so ethical, aesthetic, political, philosophical, and scientific ideas express the essence of a certain social system. The concept of phenomenon may be understood as a manifestation of something underlyingly profound. This is similar to the way we use the term symptom as the external manifestation of the essence of some disease, a headache, for example. Essence, on the other hand, is the principle and foundation of a certain mode of the external expression of things. Phenomenon as the external aspect is based on the internal essence. It is that in which the principles has expressed itself. What matters for a phenomenon is the result of the functioning of the principle as essence. The categories of essence and phenomenon characterize the independence of processes that take place in reality and the level to which thought has penetrated its object, whether we are still only on the surface or have broken through to the essence. A phenomenon usually expresses only some facet of essence, one of its aspects. For example, many manifestations of the essence of a certain type of malignant tumor may have been well researched, but its essence still remains an ominous secret. The essence is hidden from view while the phenomenon stands out on the surface. If essence is something general, phenomenon is individual, expressing only one element of essence. If essence is something profound, phenomenon is external, richer and more colorful. If essence is something stable and necessary, phenomenon is transient, changing, and accidental. Appearance. A phenomenon may or may not correspond to its essence, and this may happen to varying degrees. For example, mirages in the desert are a phenomenon of nature, not an optical illusion. They can be photographed. They are the result of a distortion of light rays in the atmosphere. As something that is seen, a phenomenon does, of course, depend on the eyes that are looking at it. In the time of Copernicus, and before him, people perceived the apparent rotation of the sun around the earth as a reality, and how much effort and sacrifice were required to prove that this rotation was merely an appearance, that in essence the earth rotates around the sun and around its own axis. Appearance is supported by essence, but does not always correspond to it. Appearance is essence in one of its definitions, aspects, or moments. In art, for example, Appearance is the result of one or another form of discrepancy between phenomenon and essence, aim and the means, action and result, a discrepancy between what a person is in fact and what he wishes to appear or claims to be. Essence reveals the comic side in appearance. The category of appearance has an objective-subjective character and expresses superficial knowledge. It manifests itself in numerous forms. To understand any given event, we must critically examine the data of direct observation and make a clear distinction between the relations of being and appearing. An indication of whether we have discovered the essence of something is our ability to use it effectively, to guide this or that process in the desired direction, even if that direction is not always the wisest. The individual, the general, and the particular. Consider, for instance, the leaves of a maple tree, how closely they resemble each other. But no two of them are absolutely identical. And in the world in general, there is nothing absolutely identical to something else, or even to itself at different moments of its existence. Things differ from each other and in themselves. We speak of things as being as alike as two drops of water, but look at them through a microscope and those drops turn out to be different. There are no doubles in the world, though its population runs into billions. Every person is unique. Pure identity can exist only in formal terms. For those just tuning in, this is I'm just reading. This is the fourth part of a series called Something to Think About. It's from Dr. Richard Allen Miller. Sent me a chapter of this book, and that's basically what this is. I'm just reading this out. So if you haven't heard part 1, part 2, or part 3, you might be a little lost here, but fascinating stuff nonetheless. So it's just knowledge from Doc R.A.M. to me, to you, is what this is. So anyway, we will continue. Let us imagine two objects whose structure and other attributes are all absolutely identical. But in the case they would have to occupy one and the same place at one and the same time. And if this were so, we should be confronted not with two objects but with one. Our two objects occupy different positions in space, so they are in different relations with other objects, and this, in its turn, is bound to give rise to a difference in their properties at the given moment. On the same grounds, one may assert that things, events, are absolutely irrepeatable in time. Nothing happens twice. Everything that happens must obey the inexorable principle of the irreversibility of time. The so-called repeated event differs from what it repeats in that it occurs at a different time, and therefore in new conditions that leave their sometimes there's a new word in here, ineradicable, individualizing mark upon it. The individual is an object taken in its distinctness from everything else and in its unique specific. The characteristic thing about the individual is its distinctness from everything else, its qualitative singularity. Here we come up against the concept of other. Other is not this. It is the background from which the object emerges and from which it differs as from everything else. Countless unique conditions, a host of accidents take part in the molding of the individual. In the example of the maple leaves, we have the difference in lighting, nutrition, temperature, microclimate, which gives rise to differences in size, color, shape, weight, and so on. Nature abhors the stereotype. It is inexhaustible in its creation of the individual. The individual is a category expressing the relative particularity, discreteness, delimitedness of one thing from another in space and time. The intrinsic peculiarities that make up an object's unique qualitative and quantitative character. As a reflection in our consciousness in the form of a sensus image or concept, the individual is defined either by a proper noun, Shakespeare, Paris, etc., or by demonstrative pronouns, this, that, the given, and also by other specific means of communication. The reality of the individual provides the objective basis for the quantitative expression of reality, because it is the real prototype of the unit 1, which we use as the basis of counting. One may treat not only a single object, but a whole class of such objects as individual, if it is taken as something integral, relatively independent, existing in the limits of a certain measure. At the same time, one object is in itself a certain set of individual parts, which in their turn consist of their own separate parts. Infinite diversity is only one aspect of existence. Another aspect is the universality of things, their structures, properties, and relations. Just as firmly as we stated that there are no two absolutely identical things, we can also say that neither are there two absolutely different things, which have absolutely nothing in common. The notion of the world only as an infinite diversity of individualities is one-sided and therefore false. The individual, the particular, and the general, if taken separately, lose each other and fall apart. As a unit, however, they do not dissolve into one another, but retain their specific qualities. Separate phenomena are interconnected, interact, depend upon, and condition each other. Consequently, they have this something in common. All stars, for example, possess common features distinguishing them from everything else. The same may be said of plants, animals, and so on. The general is the singular in the many. The one-sided analytical view of reality as a multiplicity of singularities is characteristic of narrow empiricism, which regards the individual as primary and the general only as a derived abstraction. For example, the assertion that a certain action is a feat implies acknowledgement of this one action as having a certain general quality. Other actions possessing a similar moral content may be characterized as feats. A person may be writing something. He may write many pages and put his signature on each of them. He may write with a quill pen, a ballpoint, or chalk. He may even write with his feet or mouth. There have been such experiments, believe it or not. And still, we shall not find any exact identity in the way the letters are delineated. On the other hand, the author's unique handwriting can be identified in all variations of the signature. It is this unvarying quality that gives our signatures practical importance, their legal force. The same applies to our walk of the timbre of our voice, as stable elements in the whole mass of our unique separate movements and sounds. I believe that's timbre, actually, not timbre. All right, let me take a coffee sip. And a vape. And we shall continue. The common properties and relations of things are identified on the basis of generalism in the form of concepts and are denoted by substantive nouns. For example, man, law, cause, etc. In each individual there may be something general, which is its essence. Why is the general intrinsically connected with the individual? Because it is the law of the birth and life of the individual. The general plays a constructive role in the emergence of the individual. The general contains a law which insistently demands that certain processes should follow a certain course in any individual phenomenon of the given class. For example, the information recorded in the molecular structures of the cellular nucleus is a general program, in accordance with which the organism's processes of individual development occur and its hereditary features are passed on from generation to generation. The human being's generic essence in the general groundwork of heredity is transmitted from generation to generation and in unity with all the natural and social conditions creates individuality. But upon this groundwork that is common to the whole line of descent, each descendant draws its own individual, unique pattern. The individual is dominated by the general, which ruthlessly forces it as something transient to perish again and again for the sake of preserving the general as something stable. In other words, the individual dies, but the race lives on. On the other hand, The individual serves as a prerequisite and substratum of the general. The operation of law, the anonymous power of the general, is expressed only in the individual and through the individual. But a new law begins by acting as an exception to the general rule, whether it is the birth of a new biological species, new social relations, or whatever. This was how the standards of morality originated, how fashions appear, and so on. Moreover, individual exceptions which correspond to the new trends of development, to the demands of the whole set of conditions in the nature of the phenomenon itself, gradually become the general. Accidental individual aberrations are sifted out and disappear, canceling each other out and producing the average, the resultant, that is to say, a regularity or law. For the individual to exist outside the general world for the individual to exist outside the general would amount to its being an outlaw, and the general without the individual is simply suspended in midair. But objects may possess different degrees of individuality. The generality between a star and a rose, what they have in common, is one thing, but the generality within the different varieties of roses is quite another. Everything individual is transient. Every individuality passes like a shadow and suffers the fate of all transient forms. The general, on the other hand, is stable, constant, unvarying. The individual cannot arise, survive, or change without being connected with a multiplicity of other things. And since various things are interconnected, interact, and interdepend, they must have some point of contact. They must possess generality. In histories of scientific achievement, the general usually takes first place and is seen as something principal and determining. But in the process of research, the general is revealed by generalization of individual facts. Scientific treatises that begin with a statement of general principles sometimes create the illusion that the general is independent of the individual and can exist without it. For objective idealism, it is characteristic to separate the general and the individual and the absolutize the former, thus turning the general into a demiurge, as if it had preceded the individual and created it. The fact of the matter is that the individual thing owes the concrete form of its existence to the system of regularly formed relations within which it arises. Different things become comparable only because they possess a certain degree of generality. In reality, the individual and the general are so closely united and interacting that one can say that the individual is as general as it is individual. The statement, "Dante is a poet," illustrates how the individual becomes the general. The particular only partially enters the general, and the general cannot embrace all particular objects, or all aspects of a given object. The desire to lump together all the specific features of individual phenomena in a general concept denotes a failure to understand both thinking and science. It puts the theoreticism in a situation where he cannot see the wood for the trees. A little coffee sip here. Make this a little bigger too. Uh-oh. Let's see. All right. Just a second, folks. Get my breath together. Little vape pen. And we continue. So, what is the particular? This category expresses a real object as a whole in the unity and correlation of its opposing elements, the individual and the general, and also the universal. The particular is not merely an intermediate link between the individual and the general. Rather, it is a uniting principle in the framework of the whole. An object can be conceived only in the categories of either the individual or the general. separated from one another at the empirical or theoretical level. This is an abstraction that is essential to the process of cognition. Such abstractions are not only presupposed, but also subsumed in the category of the particular, which expresses the general in its actual embodiment and the individual in its unity with the general. Consequently, the particular may be regarded as the realized general. For example, the general plan to build a house is realized in a specific project, and the latter is embodied in a real house. The particular is conceived as something separate, different from everything else, and possessing features that other objects do not possess, and at the same time as something that has various connections and relations with them. The category of the particular is relative and fluid. In one relation, the particular may more or less approximate to the general and act and be understood as something general in its connection with its own general nature. The particular stands midway between the general and the individual, holding them in its embrace, as it were, and including them in itself. It is important in both theory and practice to understand the dialects of the individual, particular, and general. Not for nothing does the whole history of philosophy revolve around this question. To understand separate phenomena, we must take them out of their general connection and examine them analytically. But the stating of individual facts is not yet knowledge. People sometimes say, if you know one man, you know them all. But this is not true. The individual can be understood only through the general and vice versa. Thanks to its psychophysiological, linguistic, and logical machinery of universalization, scientific thought permeates everything with a spirit of generalization, in which all that is individual evaporates and is replaced by the impersonal and the generally significant. But to be successful in practice, one must know not only the general, but also the individual that forms a unity with it. Science is concerned with the generalization and operates with general concepts. This enables it to establish laws and thus to arm practice with the ability to predict. This is its strong point, but it is also its weakness, which can be compensated by both ordinary and artistic thinking. Everything individual pales in the light of scientific thought. When scientific thought penetrates reality, all its rich and infinite diversity is stripped away and its splendid colors fade. The living flow chokes in the silence of meditation. The fullness that radiates its warmth upon us and is organized in innumerable attractive and delightful images is broken down into cut and dried forms and diagrams. The individual is richer than the general. The general, as a law, is narrow and schematic. Only by thoughtful analysis and consideration of the individual and the particular, through observation and experiment, can the laws of science be extended in depth and made more concrete. The person who has no appetite for the individual fails to perceive true reality. Creative thought permits no stereotypes, no magic wands that can be used everywhere in the same way, without taking into account the individual aspects of events. If the individual is ignored, our knowledge of the general and the particular falters just where individual features constitute the essential aspect of the given object, whether it be a social revolution, a nation, or a person. Thus, the concept man fails to reflect the countless individual features that are characteristic of any specific person. The principle of individualization is important not only in art, which cannot exist without it, but also in science, and particularly in practice. For example, the sciences concerned with humanity cannot ignore the fact that in the details of their anatomical structure and the functioning of various organs, in the chemical composition of the brain, blood, muscles, and skin, in the reactions of the organism to drugs and to countless other influences, in the types of temperature regulation, sensitivity to pain, and need for food, people are astonishingly unique. When determining the average velocity of the molecules of gas, we do not investigate the behavior of each separate molecule. No one is worried about depersonalizing them. In quantum mechanics, for example, as distinct from classical mechanics, it is fundamentally impossible to trace each particle separately and thus distinguish between them. So there is a good reason for us to say that in quantum mechanics, particles lose their individuality. And such individuality is probably of little consequence to either science or practice. But in medicine, for example, it is quite a different matter. The doctor treats not man in general, but a person suffering from specific disease, a person with unique individual features, often astonishing by intricate mental and bodily peculiarities, which are of crucial importance to the essence of the case. One and the same illness is often surprisingly modified in different patients and therefore demands an extremely individualized approach. Everyone gets ill in his own way. So the wisest doctors have always maintained that one should treat not the disease but the patient himself, with his particular organs and energy. Every sick person is, above all, a personality with physiological and psychological peculiarities, with a particular character, mentality, moods, emotions, and so on. How many people suffer, and sometimes very painfully, from iatrogenic ailments caused by the standardized thinking, by the crudely inflexible approach of a doctor who disregards his patient's often individually delicate and uniquely complex constitution. But the individualized personal approach, so often advocated and so often ignored, is only one aspect of the case, the other being that a doctor cannot prescribe single medicine or any kind of treatment until it has been thoroughly treated under laboratory conditions and thus been proved fit for general use. Medicine is not only the most complex science. To an even greater degree, it is an art, and the greatest of all arts at that, and it is acquired through integral knowledge of the general, individual, and particular, with the stress on the individual form of their expression. The conclusions of science are generally significant because the phenomena themselves contain something stable, something that is firmly retained and gives them their generally significant character. Although every organism is something unique, the doctor has no doubt that certain organs in a particular patient fulfill the same functions as in other people, that their structure, despite some individual variations, is, on the whole, similar. And this is what enables him to describe the structure of the brain in general, the heart in general, and so on. If each of us had a unique structure and way of functioning or malfunctioning, there could be no anatomy, physiology, or medicine as a science and no art of healing. Quick sip of coffee. And a vape. And we continue. Leo Tolstoy, who ridiculed the impotence of medicine that ignored the principle of individualized approach, wrote, "Doctors came to see her, both singly and in consultation, talked endlessly in French, German, and Latin, criticized one another, and prescribed every sort of remedy to cure every complaint they had ever heard of. But it never occurred to one of them to make the simple reflection that the disease Natasha was suffering from could not be known to them, just as no complaint afflicting a living being can ever be entirely familiar, for each living being has his own individual peculiarities, and whatever his disease, it must necessarily be peculiar to himself, a new and complex malady unknown to medicine, not a disease of the lungs, liver, skin, heart, nerves, and so on, as described in medical books, but a disease consisting of one out of the innumerable combinations of the ailments of those organs." This passage contains both exaggeration and the profound wisdom of the all-around approach to the personality and its suffering that interlock in every possible way. The principle of individualization is no less important, say, in judicial practice, and in any other sphere concerning human beings and human relations. A person is not born a criminal. A judge should not restrict himself to establishing the degree of guilt and responsibility of a certain individual for the crime he has committed. he is bound to consider the individual's character, the degree of individual violation in the crime, and also the offender's readiness to make amends, which is extremely important when it comes to deciding the measure of punishment within the framework of the existing laws of state. Science cannot exist without basing itself on the general. Take, for example, such a science as history. Yes, history is a science. If historians confined themselves to recording only the individual, even they in their thousands would be unable to describe one single day in the life of humanity, though they were given 1,000 years to do it in. They would be like an author who takes 2 years to write 1 year of his autobiography. There are some thinkers who do not regard history as a science on the grounds that it does not reveal general principles or laws. The concept of law-governed historical development is considered intrinsically contradictory in the same way as one might regard a concept of dry moisture. The field of social experience is regarded as unique and personal. All social relationships are irrepeatable. If some things happen in history, the same thing can never occur again, and for things that do not repeat themselves, no law can be established. Do these objections stand up? Well, no. Individual events in their specific forms do not repeat themselves. Every war is unique in its individuality. But in this uniqueness of social and psychological tragedy, there is always something general. War is war. There are two roads towards cognition of the general. Theoretical thought proceeds by abstracting from the individual, the accidental, to the formulation of concepts that reflect the essential. There is also another road towards knowledge of the general. This lies through finding the most characteristic individual events which, no matter how unique they are, immediately, as it were, represent the general, the law-governed. These are typical individualities. This is the way the generalizing, creative force of imaginative thinking operates in the sphere of art, where a truly artistic image expresses the typical through its individualization. Something synthetic between these two roads occurs in historical science, where the law governed is expressed both in the form of theoretical principles and also by the splendid artistic descriptions of living events, sometimes achieved by gifted historians. All right, next little mini section here. Probably get through this next little mini section, and then we'll call it a wrap, and then we'll finish the rest of this segment in part 5. So here we go. Law as a general and essential relation. Actually, hold on. Let me see here. 1 second, folks. Oh, boy. Let's see. Oh, this is always fun. Gotta love technology. You know, actually, I think... All right, let's see how... Because we've been going for about 45 minutes. I generally like to keep these at between 30 to 45 minutes. Let's see how much longer this next little segment is. Actually, yeah, that's a pretty good place to stop here. The next two parts kind of bounce off each other, leading into the end. So we're about halfway through this. So I'm going to go ahead and end this right here. So that concludes part 4 of Something to Think About. And I'm going to put out part 5 probably tomorrow, just because, you know, we're stopping dead middle of this segment of this chapter. And you know, I'm glad that so many of you enjoyed this little mini series. I thought nobody was really going to care, but we've got a lot of people listening to these. So thanks, guys, for listening to this, and you can thank Dr. Richard Allen Miller, really. And once again, if you guys are interested in this stuff, this is from the book Dialectical Materialism by A. Spirkin, Spirkin. And this whole thing we're reading is Chapter 2, The System of Categories in Philosophical Thought. So, and I'm breaking it down segment by segment in each part of the series. So there you have it. And for anybody listening right now, tomorrow night we've got, or anybody listening live rather, we've got Lori McDonald coming on tomorrow night. Going to have a fantastic time with her. And, what's funny is also I pre-recorded, I was the guest on Explaining Esoterica with Kelly Farmer. We pre-recorded the show yesterday, but she's going to do a live stream of that pre-recorded show during her normal show time, which, is the same time that we do our live show. So no matter which show you listen to tomorrow night from 7 to 9 Pacific, either that or ours, you're going to hear me either way. So there you go. And that was a fun show we did with her as well. Very informative too. So I'd highly recommend checking both of those out. You obviously can't do it at the same time, but you know what I mean. That's why we have archives. And let's see. There was something else. Oh yeah. A lot of people I get a lot of Facebook messages from a lot of listeners that all different kinds of articles and videos and just very interesting stuff. And trust me when I say I do look at a lot of that stuff, and I'm constantly, amazed at some of these finds you guys are having. I know I don't respond to each and every individual message, but I just hope nobody's offended by that. But definitely keep those articles coming, keep those videos coming, because it's really helpful for me. A lot of these topics get brought up on the show because of that, and I really do appreciate the time you guys take to send us all those articles and stuff. So definitely keep that stuff coming. And Facebook is great for that, like you guys are doing, but also feel free to share with us on Twitter too, because Twitter's our main platform really, and a lot of that stuff we could just retweet. Anyway, keep that good stuff coming. A lot of good thinkers out there, a lot of good researchers out there, and sharing the information with us. So we do appreciate that. Anyway, it's about time for me to boogie on out of here and get some grub for the evening and get ready for tomorrow's show. So ladies and gentlemen, this has been another edition of our mini-series, Something to Think About, from Dr. Richard Allen Miller to me to you. All right, we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great, wonderful evening. Cheers to you.